Okay, so you guys have made it all the way to the end of the tutorial. I admire you. This is just going to be a brief summary and a recap of what we've learned so far. Okay, so first we had an introduction to what a function was. So we create functions by calling func, and then we give it a name. I'm just going to call this sum function. If I can spell, still can't type. And we have parameters. We can have parameters or not. If we want a return type, we do it by calling this arrow, and then whatever return type we want here, return type. Okay, and then I'm just going to leave it blank for now. And then we have the body of the function inside of these brackets here. Okay, and functions are just a way to kind of contain a piece of code that performs a task, preferably only a small task. So it's not a good idea to have a function perform this huge task. It would be a better idea to break your big task down into many smaller ones and have little functions that do those. So those are what we call helper functions. Okay. So we can have functions that call other functions. We didn't really cover that very much, but it's fairly intuitive. And so yeah, so this is a simple function. We can have functions with return types. So these are going to be function. This can have, I'm going to call this some other function. And so it can have a return types. This one could have return type string, for example. And in this case, it would have to return and then some string. Okay, and then we had functions. So another function that took in parameters. So we can have parameter 1. And we can have multiple parameters if we want. So we have parameter 1, so some kind of name and then a type. And then, yeah, so we can have multiple parameters. We can have just the one parameter that we saw. And we can combine this with a return type if we want, or we can just leave it as is. Okay, and then we looked at functions with if statements in them. So function conditional function. And this basically could take in parameters or not. Parameter, and we'll have type, and then we'll have we had some kind of return value. And then we had basically just an if, and then some kind of condition, and then some kind of code to run. And then in this case in our case we had a return inside of this function, so that it was an if this condition is true, then we return this value, else we return something else. Okay, and lastly we had a function that had, and this one was for in loop function, and it basically took in a parameter and a type again, and we had some kind of return, and then we had a for index in 0, some, let's just say 0, some end, and then we had some kind of code, some code run in here, and then in our case we just use this to iterate through an array of strings and just combine them all. Okay, so the examples we used for each one, we had just a basic function that had some kind of print something. Then we had some other function which was some kind of return some kind of a string. And the string we returned was, in our case, was just a combination of two strings. Then this one we had another function with some kind of return, or it had a parameter and some kind of return, or of some kind of type. So the first one we looked at was simply a double function, so it just took in an int as a parameter and it doubled it and had it print out. And then we had one that took in two ints and multiplied them and then also printed those. And then we had some kind of an if statement within a function. So this one, the example we used was the max function. So it basically took in two ints, compared them, and each part of the if statement returned the maximum 1. So the first condition we tested was if the number 1 was greater than number 2, and if it was, we returned number 1, else we returned number 2. Okay, so that was an if statement in a function. And then for the for in loop, again, we just used an array of strings, and we iterated through and combined the strings, just kind of adding each element in the array onto the end of a string and returning it at the end. Okay, so just very briefly, I'll talk about functions that call other functions. So let's say we have, I'm just going to comment all of these out because otherwise I'm going to get massive errors. And as you can see, it's kind of blowing up here. Alright, so that's all commented out and good. So let's say we had some kind of function that was, let's say, function, and this time I'm just going to have a very simple example because I think by now you guys should understand how to do this. So this one's just going to be double numbers, and we're going to use that same example. We're going to take in number 1, it's going to be of type int, and we're going to take in number 2, and that's going to be of type int as well, and we're going to not return anything, and we're just going to have this, we'll have a constant, and actually let's have it a variable. Number 3 equals, actually this shouldn't be double, this should be multiply numbers. Okay, so we'll have number 3 equals number 1 times number 2. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to call another function, which I'm going to add down here, and this one's just going to be print something. So it's going to take in a parameter that can be, in this case, we're going to take in an int. So this will be, in fact, I should call this print int. Funny little name. And this will be taken a number, and it'll be of type int. And again, it's not going to return anything. It's just going to simply call the print function on number. And then here we're going to call it, so print int. And we're just going to have it print number 3. Okay, so let's go ahead and, what's the issue here? Okay, yeah, sure, we'll change that to a constant. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we've kind of seen this concept already, functions that call other functions, when we had the print statement inside of a function. But just to recap, we have this function's taking a couple of numbers, it's multiplying them and storing the results in number 3, and then it's calling this print int with the results of that number, okay? And this is another function that we've created, which is just going to print out our number, okay? So this function is performing this task, and it's calling another function by calling the name within the first function and passing it this parameter. Now we don't have to pass in a parameter if we don't want, but in this case it's appropriate. And this is just going to take in a number and print it out. Okay, so then if we were to call multiply numbers, and we'll just give it 5 and 4, and I guess I should add in the last bracket there. What do you think we should have happen? Well, what's going to happen is multiply numbers is going to plug in, just going to close that quickly, it's going to plug in a 5 and it's going to plug in a 4. It's going to say, okay, well it's going to multiply the two together, and then it's going to call print int with the results of that number, so it's going to do 5 times 4, so 20 will be number 3. It's going to say print int with 20. This is going to take in 20 and it's going to print 20 out. And indeed, we get 20 printed out in the console. Okay, so this was just a very basic example. We've kind of seen stuff like this when we call the print function anyway, because this is actually a function that's calling the print function. But yeah, so that's all you really need to know about the basics of functions. Again, like with all of the tutorials, play around with it a little bit. I strongly recommend you practice with functions that call other functions, because it's a good habit to get into, particularly if you have a function performing some massive task where there's a lot of different things going on. It's a better idea to break it into what we call smaller helper functions and then just have a series of functions calling other functions. Okay, Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, guys. Really appreciate the support. Hope you learned a lot from this video, and I hope you enjoyed yourself. And otherwise, check out our other videos. And yeah, we'll hopefully see you next video.